Namaste, everyone. Most welcome, Professor Nair. Welcome, everybody, to Sangam Talks. I would like to introduce Professor Rana Nair's latest book, Corona Chronicles, an intimate history of the pandemic chronicles. Uh, in this book, he chronicles his life through the pandemic, having had a very long career of 37 years in the largest and one of the oldest universities of India, the Punjab University. Dr. Nair was suddenly isolated of his ever buzzing social life of an academic institution. This book is a mixture of fact and fiction, of personal impressions and reporting of one of the most cataclysmic events that our generation has witnessed. Corona Chronicles documents the living history of the pandemic in an intimately engaging, incisively sensitive, and easy to grasp lucid style. It's a story that tells itself. And here, the author is only a witness, a living testimony, and not an overbearing narrator. It's a story of how the virus surreptitiously entered our lives and turned our lives upside down. It's a story of how we fought the disease individually and collectively, how we succumbed to it or survived, and even triumphed over it at times. It's a story of all we may have lost or gained on account of it, and what lessons we may or may not have imbibed through it. Dr. Nair retired as a professor from the Department of English and Cultural Studies in the Punjab University, Chandigarh. He has around 23 books to his credit. His main areas of interest are world drama, theatre, translations, translation studies, literary theory, and cultural studies. He has translated 15 modern classics of Punjabi into English. He has also one collection of poems, Breathing Spaces, and five critical books. He's won many prestigious awards for his works, especially his translation of the Sufi saint Baba Farid. Dr. Nair, now over to you for your book.
Thank you, Aparna. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Aparna and other members of Sangam Group who have given me this opportunity to talk about my latest book, Corona Chronicles. Before I get into the book and start talking about it, uh, I would like to raise a question which, incidentally, I have raised in the prologue to this book. And to my mind, that question is important. The question is, we have all been through this, as Aparna put it, a cataclysmic event. It was no less than that. We all know it. We almost found ourselves on the edge of precipice. And we were not sure when it started whether we would return from it safe or not. So, why should I actually take you down this valley of death that we all have been through and inflict what I like to call a double torture on you? Why should I torture you twice? You've been through it once, and by writing about it and by offering it to you, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to add to your agony, to your anguish, to the sense of torture that you already have experienced? Or am I trying to do something different? All I would like to say in my defense is that, to my mind, whenever we remember a traumatic event, whether it's a personal one, a social one, or a global one, as was the case with COVID-19, it is always with the idea of trying to make sense of it. Because when we live through any experience, that's my contention, I may be wrong there, that we don't quite understand what is happening to us. Because at that point of time, we are busy grappling with the trauma. We are busy grappling with the situation. So we are not actually able to understand what is happening to us. And it's only in hindsight, when we throw some kind of a backward glance on the event, that we are able to make some sense of it. That is one. And the second reason is, why is it important to understand, or why is it important to make sense of something that may have happened to us? Because that, to my mind, is the only way in which we can possibly heal ourselves. And that is my real reason for writing this book. This is a trauma that was not personal. This is a trauma that one nation did not just go through. This is a trauma that the entire humanity suffered together. So when I take you down this valley of death once again through the book, my idea is that somewhere you should be able to relate to your own experience. You should be able to make some sense of it. And in the process, some healing should take place. I don't know how far I would actually succeed in this intention, because that is something only a reader can decide for himself. But that is exactly why I wrote this book. Now, I come to the second question. How did it all start? Corona engaged us at so many different levels. All our emotional, physical, intellectual energies were in the service of dealing with this crisis. And at that point of time, how could I actually think of writing a book? Let me confess that it started with something as small as this. You understand that when it initially started, it was some kind of a novel situation. It was a kind of a situation that we were not really prepared for. As a matter of fact, we didn't even know what kind of protocol we had to follow during COVID-19. As a matter of fact, the states had to intervene and give us a blueprint of the protocol that we were expected to follow. It's another matter that most of us did or did not follow that protocol, but that's a separate question. So we were not prepared for this kind of a situation. And therefore, suddenly one day, as Aparna put it in our introduction, yes, of course, one little correction that I would like to offer here is that I had already retired when Corona happened. I retired in 2017. So it's not that I was leading a very busy life, going to the university, taking my classes, or doing active research. I was sitting at home, no doubt, and leading a retired life. But then, suddenly, when you are told that now you have to lock yourself indoors and stay indoors, and you're not to step out of your own house, the first feeling that comes to your mind is that now you're going to be a prisoner inside your home. You were a free bird. You were a free human being. You could go anywhere. But when this happened, we were suddenly told, stay indoors. That was one of the first precautions, of course, that was announced. And of course, along with it, there were a series of other protocols. You had to use a kind of a hand wash, sanitize yourself. You had to wear masks if you ever stepped out in public. And you were also expected to keep safe distance from people. All this was very, very new and also bizarre to some extent. I don't know how you felt when it happened, but I remember very distinctly that I began to experience a sense of fear and paranoia on account of it. And this fear and paranoia stemmed from the fact that we were not quite sure whether when it gets over, will be able to step out of our homes alive or shall be entombed inside. In fact, that was the fear. It was a very palpable fear. It was a very real fear. And it was very, very strong, especially in the initial stages. In fact, what really happened was that every member of the family would experience this fear, but none would verbalize it. We would not even share it with the family members. But at some point, I decided to verbalize it to my own family. And I said, I feel I'm going through some kind of a terrible sense of insecurity. So I verbalized my fear, and that is when the suggestion came that I should start writing a diary. Initially, when I thought of writing Corona Chronicles, it was with the idea of dealing with this terrible sense of fear that I was experiencing. Then came along a message, and this message was from some professor in California, professor of history. This message he had sent out to his own students. And in that message, he said, we are living through very unusual times. And therefore, as students of history, and this was meant for all his students, past and present, we should try and record this event. I think that was the deciding factor. That actually settled it for me. That's when I decided that I was going to record it. You know, when we record an event or when we write a book, we don't really know who we are writing for. We may be writing for the present generation, or we may be writing it for let's say, people who may come 100 years from now. The reason for that is very simple, because these pandemics, as we all understand, follow a certain kind of a cyclical pattern. Every 100 years or so, there is a pandemic. The last pandemic we saw was in 1919. It was known as Spanish flu. And that actually killed hundreds and thousands of people. Several hundred thousands, actually. So, and when we were initially going through this pandemic, COVID-19, one of the questions that intrigued me was, what happened to people during the Spanish flu? How did they deal with it? What is the protocol they followed? How did they survive the pandemic? These were some of the questions that I was trying to grapple with. And that's when I made up my mind that I'm going to record this event. And let me also share it with you that when COVID-19 happened, there was a kind of an information overload everywhere. What I mean by information overload is whether you switched on a television or you read newspapers or you went to other sources of information, social media, so on and so forth, everywhere, everyone was talking about COVID-19. So much was happening, and there was so much of information about it. As a matter of fact, what it created for me as a writer was a problem of plenty. There was so much to choose from, but then I had to decide that one must choose incidents and anecdotes in such a manner that they appear to be authentic at one level and also interesting for the reader. Because somewhere you have to, while writing a book, somewhere you have to think about the interest of the reader. You have to think in terms of engaging a reader. So this is exactly how the journey started. I remember when it initially happened, I started looking around as to what the situation was like in my immediate surrounding. You know, we start with the family, but luckily nothing happened. within the family in the initial few months or weeks. But in Chandigarh, the first case was reported early on in March. I've recorded that in the book as well. One young girl came from London and, unmindful of the fact that Corona was already there, she went about her business as usual. She went to the friends, she went to parties, she went to a hair salon, and at the end of it all, she had tested COVID positive. Now, this intrigued me and set me thinking. Someone who has come from London obviously is an educated person. And there is a protocol in place which says that you must be mindful of this virus and therefore need to take certain precautions, and you have to quarantine yourself. If you remember, that is the way in which it had been laid down. But an educated young girl, she cares two hoots for the protocol, and as a result, she ends up spreading infection among a lot of her neighbors and friends. Another reason why I actually became interested in this particular incident was because she happened to be living in Sector 21 in the neighborhood of one of my friends. He obviously now lives in Sector 21, Chandigarh, but at that point but when we were much younger, we used to be neighbors and our children grew up together. So you have a sense of affinity with someone whose children you've seen growing up. So you want to know what kind of situation he's going through. And I remember when I read about this young girl and I discovered that she was living in the neighborhood of one of my good friends, I called him up. He was so happy that I gave him a call. He says, Rana, no one calls up. No one wants to bother about you. No one wants to even check on you for the fear that you might suggest something that they would not be able to do for you. So the idea is it had imposed a very different kind of isolation on all of us. And I think there was some sense in talking about this isolation caused by social distancing, so on and so forth. I also remember another incident. I would not really name that person, which again I've recorded in the diary. This is a young singer who came from London and she landed in Lucknow. She came to Delhi, obviously, and then she went to Lucknow where she lived. And there she went to a high profile party where 500 people were present, including some ministers and some MLAs and some film stars, so on and so forth. And she ended up becoming a super spreader. You remember? This was a term very often used for people who caused infection among a large number of population. They were known as super spreaders. A very dubious distinction to have, but anyway, this was the kind of distinction. So all these things, when I read about them, I decided to record them with the idea, because it intrigued me. How can people who are educated, who know what social protocol is, still they are not mindful of the fact that they can end up as super spreaders and they can actually transmit the disease to a large number of people? There was total breakdown of what I call civic sense. We, as an individual, I have responsibility towards my family. But as a citizen, I also have responsibility towards my fellow citizens. I think there was total breakdown of the civic responsibility. But then there are strange kind of incidents. If on one hand we have educated people behaving in a manner which was worse than the illiterates, you also had number of cases of people who were actually illiterate. farm laborers. I remember an incident which I've recorded again. There were 3 farm laborers who, in early on in January, because they didn't really find much of a work in their hometown, Moga, they decided to travel to a place far off in Madhya Pradesh, where they found some work. That's when lockdown happened. Now they had no means of returning home. And you know what they did? The 3 of them, they bought 3 second-hand cycles and they traveled a distance of about 1,500 kilometers to reach home. Home was a kind of a place where you were stricken with all kinds of insecurities and fears. And home was still the place where you thought you would be secure and you might survive. So home again acquired all kinds of connotations for different people. But the reason why I'm talking about this particular incident is because they did something which we do not generally expect of people who are not highly qualified or educated. They decided to quarantine themselves for 14 long days. I was so happy to discover that on one hand we have set of people who are unmindful of their civic responsibility, and on the other we have people who are aware of the social protocol and who are willing to go out of the way to perform what we call civic responsibility. So this myth that we generally have, that in crisis people who are educated, they are better equipped to deal with the situation, was actually shattered. This was one of the myths which was shattered for me, and I've talked about it at great length in the book. Now, I also discovered that in my immediate neighborhood, there were people who used to be busy on the phones all the time, and when they would take a walk around the complex, they would not even talk to each other. But suddenly, when Corona happened, because there was high degree of self-isolation, I found people had become more chatty and more conversational. Now they would stop in the tracks and talk to you for good 25 to 30 minutes, obviously with the masks on and maintaining the necessary social distance. But these kind of little changes in human behavior that I observed, which were caused, I think, because of Corona, I thought were worth recording, and that is precisely what I've done. Now, we all understand that Corona did not just affect people in a particular city. It was a global phenomenon. So it was important for me to actually move beyond Chandigarh and see what was happening at other places. There's a section in my diary or in the chronicles where I've talked about how at one point of time there was a huge threat in Maharashtra. That's when there was a sudden spike in numbers. There was a huge threat hanging over Dharavi, which is known to be a very, very well-known slum in Mumbai, because that's where people live in 8x8 tenements, and that's where sometimes 10 to 15 family members have to be packed into such a small space. And that's where it was not possible for people to maintain any kind of a social distancing, even if they wanted to, because they are so close and they don't even have access to toilets. They have to go to public toilets. So sanitation levels were very poor. living conditions were pathetic, and still they had to manage this crisis. So it was felt by the authorities that suddenly, if it spreads through Dharavi, it could take toll of huge number of people. As a matter of fact, there was a time when it was suspected that the numbers of people dying, fatality figures as we call them, would be much higher in India as compared to other countries where they had better infrastructure, better health infrastructure, doctors, medicines, oxygen, so on and so forth. And in India, we always had this feeling that we are going to face some kind of a earth-shaking experience, that we will actually go down along with Corona. That was the feeling. I'm not talking about a general feeling. I read a number of articles that were carried by New York Times, Guardian, so on and so forth, where they made prognosis of the way in which situation was developing in India, and they had nothing positive to say about it. I've talked at some point, at some length, about the way in which the foreign media gave a certain kind of negative representation to this evolving situation of Corona in India. And I was quite intrigued to know that most of the articles that were published in these newspapers were not written by foreign journalists, mind you, but were written by our own Indian journalists, so called educated elite, who were busy when Corona was happening. They were busy crowing in the foreign newspapers and creating some kind of a hate campaign against their own country. That troubled me a great deal, if you ask me. And that also made me question whether we actually understand this whole idea of liberalism. And I think I've raised this question. I'm not really going to take it up like a typical professor and try and answer that question. I think I leave it to you to speculate, because there are things that I will talk about that are there in the book, and there are things that I would not talk about, because my point is that you should ultimately go to the book. It is to prompt you to read the book so that you're able to enjoy it much better, because my narration is only there to supplement the book. It's not a substitute for what is there in the book. So I was suggesting that there were strange kind of things happening when people were managing this situation. You had a set of journalists who were busy tarnishing the image of India abroad. I'm not saying that the way in which we in India handled this situation was probably the perfect way of handling it. We also know how things went wrong during the second wave. We were able to manage the first wave still in a more successful way, but in the second wave, we were completely demolished. We didn't really know where to go. Infrastructure was not there. Oxygen was in short supply, and doctors were down with COVID-19. So we didn't really know. And that is also the time, let me remind you, when the maximum damage happened. Maximum lives in India were lost during the second wave. For us personally, it was a kind of a personal tragedy also, because we lost a number of relatives during the second wave. And I think uh, it was, that is another level at which I kind of connected with the whole thing. Now, I know people had all kinds of views when our prime minister would come on television every now and then to announce that the period of lockdown had been extended. There were a number of critics who said, oh, he should be in the boardroom managing the situation rather than appear on the television every now and then. What is he doing there? But I think personally that he actually led from the front. One of the things that happened was that immediately a central coordination committee was set up, consisting of doctors, and they began to monitor situation on the ground. I know we floundered during the second wave because of lack of infrastructure, but I think on the whole, if I have to make some kind of an assessment, I think we still managed to save more lives than were actually lost or than others suspected we are going to lose. There are certain humorous situations as well. I remember in one of his appearances or in one of the addresses to the nation, the prime minister had mentioned that all of us should get together at 9 p.m. on a certain day and bang the thalis and sing bhajans or do all kinds of things. And a lot of people laughed a great deal. They laughed the prime minister to scorn. But I remember we did that in our complex. And I also remember very distinctly that even though it did not take away from the fear or the sense of insecurity, but the pall of gloom that had otherwise descended in our lives and that had almost entered our hearts, it lifted at least for some time, and we felt alive, if not joyful. So I think sometimes, these symbolic gestures, which can very well be misunderstood by people, they have their meaning. So I have looked into all this. Apart from that, I also looked into, because I didn't just want to focus on India alone. Was not India centric, as we know. It hit it hit 8 billion people. Now, I also looked into the performance of different world leaders, the people like Boris Johnson, who actually dismissed it all off in the initial stages. And he says that there is no need for a lockdown. We are very happy without a lockdown, and we can manage it. The situation is very much under control, and we would like to go in for herd immunity. If you remember, a number of countries in the West had opted for herd immunity. They said, let there be no lockdown, let the life not come to a standstill, let people go to work the way they were doing earlier. The only thing is they have to take precautions. If anyone falls sick, let him stay at home, and then after 7 days or 14 days, return to work. In Western countries, work is very important. Work orientation is very important. And in fact, that's the reason why they went in for herd immunity. But when you look at Boris Johnson's statement, and when you compare it to what happened later in England, that is when you get an opportunity to actually look at his decision somewhat critically. A number of people died. I remember having seen a video, which I have mentioned also in the book, video of a hospital in London. You cannot imagine. It was packed like sardines. There were beds where there should be only 4 beds in a room. There were 10 beds. You could see people lying in the corridor with oxygen and with other trappings. So the idea is there was total failure of NSH. Boris Johnson thought he would be able to manage the situation, but he wasn't quite able to. He had not been able to anticipate. There has been a lot of criticism of Indian government saying that Indian government imposed lockdown, every kind of economic activity came to a standstill. But I think at that point of time, it was important not to engage in economic activity, but to save lives. And if we hadn't done that, the damage in India would have been colossal. I also remember some of the statements that Donald Trump, who was then the president of the US, he's angling for another term now, he gave. I remember once he said, though of course some people said that it was a fake video and this was made to give bad publicity to Donald Trump, but he made a statement like this. He says, if sanitizer can help us protect from corona, imagine head of the state making such a statement. I don't know what you call it, foolish or stupid or what. Why can't it be injected into human body to protect us against corona? Now that was not the end of it. He also poo-pooed corona in the initial stages. And I remember there was a little news article which said how corona spread through US and why it took a huge toll on American people. If you remember, mostly the inmates of old age homes died in US. You know the reason for it? You'll be shocked to know it. One Chinese cook who had visited home in China somewhere, he went back to US somewhere in early February. He did not know because, as you recall, COVID had started in China and it had started somewhere in December 19. Though, of course, it came to India much later, but it had already spread to US, UK, and most of the European countries before that. So he came to US and he started working in the kitchen because he was a cook in an old age home. They say all the inmates, they developed symptoms and all of them died. And because this cook was not only working in a single old age home, he was working in 10 old age homes. All the inmates in those 10 old age homes were affected. The point is, that's how corona spread. But we were unmindful of it all. I remember there was this president of Brazil who made all kinds of bizarre statements. There was a report which said, when people were dying in Brazil, do you know, he was enjoying a holiday on his private yacht. That is the kind of insensitivity some of the world leaders displayed towards corona. As a matter of fact, I raised this question in the book as well, that corona was a real test of leadership in different countries. And there was an interesting report which actually assessed the performance of a number of women prime ministers in different European countries, or heads of state, not only in Europe, but also in Taiwan at that point of time. And the news report said women heads of state had performed much better than men. And I wonder what could be the reason for it. You know, women have the necessary sensitivity because they're not only women, but they are also mothers. So they carry that maternal solicitude over to their policy decisions as well. When men take decisions, they only think of themselves. When women take decisions, they think of the family. And as heads of state, they think about the entire state. That shows a qualitative difference in the way in which some of the women heads of state handled the situation in the Western countries and the way in which these so-called great leaders, Boris Johnson, Trump, and the president of Brazil, tried to manage it in their own ludicrous fashion. Now, apart from that, there were also all kinds of controversies that surfaced during Corona. You would recall that all kinds of claims and counterclaims were being made by scientists all over the world. On one hand, we were surprised by a calamity, and on the other, we had bunch of scientists who were fighting their own little battle. There was one particular video which almost went viral during Corona. It had been produced by a scientist called Dr. Microwitz, who worked in US and who raised certain very fundamental questions about the way in which scientific research was being carried out in US and elsewhere. And she also named Fauci, who was at that point of time one of the main advisors, medical advisors to Donald Trump administration. She raised doubts about his basic integrity. If you remember, there were questions being raised that how come people like Bill Gates and so many other corporate heads had prior information about Corona? They already knew about it. And there is a theory that says that the work on vaccine had started much before Corona happened. That means it happened in 2019, but the work on Corona vaccine had started way back in 2016 or 17. And Bill Gates is on record having made this statement that there is going to be a pandemic. How do you know that? How do you know that there is going to be a pandemic? Did you know that? Did I know that? How come Bill Gates is privy to this kind of an information? Because they were all working together towards the creation of something. And it's also a moot point whether Corona was a natural disaster or was a man-made calamity. That's a basic question that we need to ask ourselves. You know, on one hand, we say that nature has turned against man. Nature is trying to teach several lessons to man because man does not heed to the repeated warnings of nature. He's destroying nature, he's pillaging nature, he's destroying forests, he's contaminating waters, and he is going for his greed is driving towards the destruction of nature. And nature is possibly teaching him a lesson through these pandemics that come with almost some kind of periodic regularity. But then we also have a theory which tells us that this virus was created in one of the labs, Chinese labs at Wuhan. And it came from there to the bats, and bats then finally transmitted it to human beings. Now, going back to Microwitz and the controversy with Fauci, you know, it has implications for us. And these are questions you might think that it's something that should only concern the scientists. But I think since our lives were at stake, therefore we need to know about all this as much as anyone else. In fact, we should be more interested in these questions, and we must know how science and scientific research works and how there has been corporatization of science. Now, what do I mean by corporatization of science? You would be surprised to know, and I was initially when I came to know about this fact, that Dr. Fauci was instrumental in getting the Intellectual Property Rights Act changed in 1980. well before Corona happened. And it had been made very, very selective. Now, all scientists could not have access to that. Only those who were signatories to the act could actually have access to intellectual property rights. Fauci was one of the beneficiaries of this. And he was also instrumental in creating this act. That'll tell you how our administration works. That'll tell you how our governments work. That'll tell you how crony capitalism works, not only in India, but in US as well. As a matter of fact, we have only imported this idea of crony capitalism from US. US is a kind of a bad model, if one can actually speak of one, where crony capitalism is practiced in its worst and in its most distorted form. You are part of the government and you have intellectual property rights. And as someone who owns intellectual property rights, I'm talking of Fauci, you also are beneficiary from the money that is coming in through the pharmaceutical companies. So you have stakes in pharmaceutical companies as well. This is the level to which things had degenerated. And all this, let me tell you, would not have been exposed but for COVID-19. So COVID-19, of course, it took toll on human lives. COVID-19 was a crisis. Some of us found it extremely difficult to manage. But COVID-19, mind you, also opened our eyes to a kind of nexus between scientists, pharmaceutical companies, administration, so on and so forth, a nexus that possibly we would not have worried about but for this. It happened in India too. You remember? There was a time when we had shortage of those protective kits which were imported from China. There was a private company which was given the contract to import these kits. I looked into some specific details and found out, much to my discomfiture, that the kits were being imported at the rate of 250 per kit. And they were being supplied to the government hospitals at the rate of 450. And if a private individual wanted to buy, they were being offered to him in the market at the rate of 650. Profit? Even in Corona? Yes. Human greed? Even during Corona? Yes. That was a sordid reality that we lived through. That's a sordid reality that we discovered. But this is not where it ends. Corona brought out, as I like to say, to play a kind of twist on Charles Darwin, who made this statement in Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I would like to say that Corona brought out the best in us, especially those who managed to survive it can claim that they coped with it in a very positive way. But it also brought out the worst in some of us, which was essentially a very sad fact. I remember an incident that was reported in the newspapers very extensively about a hospital in Mumbai, where a young doctor who had been recruited to attend to patients, and he was attending to one of the Corona patients, he actually ended up molesting that patient. What do you say to that? Doctor is supposed to protect lives. And here a doctor turns an assaulter, a molester. Not only that, the doctor is unmindful of the fact that he can contract the infection himself and can also spread it to other patients. He was arrested, placed under suspension, probably lost his job as well. He was on contract. But then there was so much that was happening inside families which probably would never be widely known. As a matter of fact, cases of domestic violence suddenly spiked during Corona. People were living through that kind of stage where they did not really know how to cope with their own anxiety, their own stress. And the easiest way to displace it was either on the children or the women in the family. So cases of domestic violence went up, cases of rape went up, child molestation, and even child pornography became a favorite pastime with people. All these are very, very sad facts, but there is a chapter in the book which says that how during COVID 19, uh, humans' unconscious was also unlocked, unlocking the unconscious. So there was lockdown, there was locking in, there was locking out. So new discoveries were being made, sad facts were being revealed or exposed. But at the same time, towards the end, I also talk about certain stories of survival. And let me tell you, these are great stories. People who fought Corona and who came out triumphant. These are great stories in courage, in human resilience, in the resilience of human spirit, and how, even the worst of crisis, human beings come up trumps. I think that chapter has to be read because I didn't really want to end the book on a very pessimistic note. As a matter of fact, there were other good things that happened during Corona. You remember reading about animals walking down the streets, birds suddenly appearing from nowhere, and twitter of sparrows in the morning? We had forgotten all about that. We had forgotten about the blue sky, and all that came back and made us realize that we have ruined through our lifestyles, through our choices, through our destruction of nature. We have ruined an entire way of life and embraced something which may not really have very positive impact for us. So, Corona was a time for great reflection, for great meditation. Corona was a time to think about several questions connected with ourselves, with our lives, with people around us, with society, with nation, and even with the world at large. Towards the end, let me just share one simple fact with you and end my uh, presentation. You'd be surprised to know that, when some scientists actually worked out the mass of coronavirus, and it turns out to be in several 100,000 nanograms. I've actually recorded it in the book, the way in which it had been worked out by the scientists. Do you know that it was 1.5 gram of coronavirus? Imagine 1.5 grams. What is it? You can't even feel the weight on your palm. It was 1.5 gram of coronavirus that had the entire humanity, consisting of 8 billion people, on the run. That is the way it is. When it comes to viruses, when it comes to bacteria, it's an unequal battle. But then there has to be preparedness. There has to be some kind of a realization. There has to be understanding. With these words, I take leave. And in case you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. What an excellent talk. What a different take on when you say Corona Chronicles, and it's an intimate history of your experience and your narration through the pandemic. It felt like probably it's your own experience. Probably you got the disease, or somebody close to you got the disease, and gave a kind of a little like how we feel about corona, a little stressful, a little morbid kind of an aura about it. But the talk is so beautiful. The book itself is the mostly the social impact, and you being the literary person you are, I would like to ask you a question about the among the social impacts you have recounted, the increase in violence. We also saw an increase of about 11 or 12%, or maybe more, of domestic violence in it. What do you think in human mind accounts for this?
Uh, uh, Aparna, I'm not really a psychologist, so I may not actually be able to explain this phenomena, but I witnessed it as an observer, and that's exactly the way I have recorded it. Yes, you're absolutely right when you say that during this period, there was a sudden spike in all kinds of cases, of violence, of domestic violence, of children being beaten up, of child pornography, of rapes, so on and so forth. So, uh, to my mind, not that I actually have a formulation, but what I would like to say is that a crisis, as I said at some point, can have a dual response. And it all depends on how an individual responds to a situation. So sometimes what happens is that during a crisis, you make contact with your better self. You tell yourself, oh my God, this tragedy has struck. Now what do I do? Let me think positive, let me do positive. But then there is another kind of a response, very contrary to it, where people say, oh my God, I don't know how to manage my demons, and let these demons dance. So when these demons begin to dance, we know what happens. There is violence, there are rapes, there is child pornography, and there are all kinds of inflictions because we are not able to exercise self control. I think this only makes us human, much too human. We are human beings after all. We are not always able to control our impulses, our responses. But I think one of the points that I'm making through the book is that we are gifted beings in the sense that we are not animals. Animals were the happiest, in fact, during Corona. Only human beings were sad. So we are not animals, we are thinking beings. So therefore, we should be able to calibrate our responses. That's the point I'm repeatedly making through this book. Why not think about our responses? Where am I going? What is happening to me? Now, how do I respond to it? But when we allow a situation to take over and to take control of us, then we can never decide which direction we would go in. Then obviously it could be towards the path of self destruction too. And a good number of people fell victims to it.
My next question. You did recount those social activities that we were asked to do, thali bajao, bells bajao, I think it was the same, bell, and lighting diyas. So, even in, like, I stay in a standalone house, and the entire street was our street. At the end of it, we have a gurudwara and two temples, and it's usually not a community. Usually they are very disparate people, but in those days, for those activities, they just came together. Like, there are children are सबके सांझे होते हैं वो एक गली में.
Hmm. Yeah.
So children, they asked us to play, I think, to beat the thali from 5 to 6 or 6 to 7 for 1 hour. This went on and on and on for 4 5 hours in
Yeah.
our lake. When they and then there were people who came out with beautiful Tibetan bells and other kinds of bells, different ghantas, mandir ka ghanta. Um, Beautiful it was. Actually, a very our social activity, like you said, people became very chatty. They started talking a lot. Here also, I noticed that the social camaraderie suddenly increased a lot for whatever little bits we met. Why can't we continue that kind of a camaraderie after the pandemic? Now it is back to the normal, like, I don't know you types.
I think, Aparna, you're very right. This did happen, and we all observed it. What happens is that COVID 19 was a kind of, or at least it created what I like to call a new normal. And because it created a new normal, because we had to lead a very different kind of a life, we had to isolate ourselves, social distancing was required, quarantining was required, and we had to observe a certain kind of social, we had to observe certain social restrictions also. So, therefore, whenever we got an opportunity to actually let our hair down, we were very happy to do it. So, yes, tali bajao, ya thali bajao, ya bhajan gao, ya come out in the streets. But let me also say that the idea was to actually give few moments of joy to people, because gloom had become pervasive. So people were getting depressed. So when they come together, when they join each other, they feel relieved. There is a kind of a general catharsis that takes place. So that is what was happening. But then that happens only when there is an oppressive situation. When we are leading our normal lives, we do everything, then even if we are dancing in the streets, it doesn't seem strange because that's the way we are. But then, you know, there are strange things that happen. Let me elaborate on it a little. There are strange things that happen. The message was that we have to bang those thalis and sing bhajans and light diyas for some time. Now, some people, as it was reported in several newspapers, they thought it was actually a license to do whatever they wanted to. So, as you also put it, people came out in the streets in large numbers. That was not required because they were supposed to do it standing in their balconies or maybe in their courtyards, but they were not supposed to hit the streets. I made this observation in one of the chapters of book that we Indians are very congregational by nature. We have this tendency to get together at the slightest of opportunities. सड़क पर कहीं एक्सीडेंट हो जाता है तो हम खड़े हो जाते हैं, भीड़ लग जाती है. उस भीड़ में कोई इस बात की परवाह नहीं करता है कि इंसान जिसका एक्सीडेंट हुआ है वो मर रहा है या जिंदा है. वी आर बिजी मेकिंग वीडियोस क्योंकि हमारे लिए वो एक साइट होती है जिसको हमने रिकॉर्ड करना होता है. सो द थिंग इज दैट वी आर कॉन्ग्रीगेशनल बाय नेचर. सो लॉकडाउन में भी यही हुआ. वी वर नॉट सपोज टू कॉन्ग्रीगेट बट वी डिड. I have talked about a particular group, social group, which actually had a conference in Delhi during that time. As a result, it led to a sudden spike in numbers. But then, you know, some people tried to kind of stigmatize that community, saying, oh, look at them, they were so irresponsible. But then half the time, we know only half the story. The full story was the same people who at one point of time were responsible for spreading infection actually came to the rescue of patients who were hospitalized. You remember at one point of time, Delhi administration made an appeal to the members of the same community that you should donate bone marrow, which was seen as one of the possible treatments for COVID-19. And they actually came forward. So, who is acting in a foolish manner and who is behaving in a responsible manner? The distinctions were blurred during this tragedy.
One more thing, two things indicate of that. One was the lack of civic responsibility especially among the educated, more among the educated.
Yeah,
And to this, what you're saying, congregational by nature, we, of course, in our street, it was not this, it was the balconies,
yeah,
beautifully lit up, and thalis, and you can hear it, it's resounding. Because if you have a temple at one end of the street, the sound is really beautifully amplified. uh, so these two things indicate, no, and the second was the journalists, the Indian journalists writing in foreign newspapers, disparaging India. uh, I think it's a kind of, like they say, politics of vultures. This was journalism of vultures. What was being reported was not really what was there on the ground. um, anything you'd like to say about that? And two, also, it became a very political thing. People who didn't like the government or didn't like Modi
yeah,
would not
yeah.
do what he asked you to do, would not even
Yes.
quarantine themselves. So it and after that, in farmers protest also, which happened almost simultaneously and
Yeah.
started around that time, they, just because you don't like the government means I'm open to corona won't affect me. Anything you'd like to say about that?
This kind of an attitude was endemic, Aparna, during COVID-19. I remember there was a lady, we were observing protocol in our society, and there was a lady who is a family friend. I'd gone to buy vegetables, and she came out and she was not wearing a mask. And I very gingerly and hesitantly asked her, "Why aren't you wearing a mask?" And you know what she says? Turns around and tells me, "Sanu corona ne ki kar lena." And I thought it was, because we are Punjabis, so what can corona do to us? And a lot of people who took part in farmers' protest actually had the same kind of a mindset. And we know a lot of people died. But in the news reports, these deaths were not reported as deaths that happened on account of corona. These deaths were reported as normal deaths. So, the point I'm trying to make is some people in a crisis choose to look the other way. They think, oh, nothing can happen. I know it's a human response. I'm not going to be judgmental and say whether it's a wise response or a foolish response. It's a human response. Some people choose to look away. Some people close their eyes the way a pigeon does and believes that the cat would never come and snatch. So the thing is, we can either be evasive or we can engage with it. I am for that kind of a latter response where people come forward, think about it, and engage with it rather than shut their eyes and tell themselves that, oh, nothing is going to happen, so let it be. Coming to your second point, which is very, very important. This whole business of media representation. I first became aware of this when I was traveling to England. This is several years ago. And there was a newspaper that was lying in the aeroplane. I picked up that newspaper. I think it was the Herald Tribune or something. I don't remember. There was a news report that day. Sister Nirmala, after the death of Sister Teresa, had been made the head of Missionaries of Charity in Calcutta. It was way back. Do you know how this was reported in the Western press or in the one of the premier newspapers of UK? It said, and this was flashed as a front page news. It said, Sister Nirmala, a Hindu, is made head of Christian mission. Now tell me, this happens only in the Western press. Do we ever, we even object to the use of Hindu terror or Sikh terror or Islamic terror, and we say, don't associate terror with any religion because terrorists have no religion. We are mindful of these things. But out in the West, they want to externalize our religion and they want to capitalize on it as well. Now, that tendency, I'd written a longish article on that as well, how media is represents, especially in the West. It's a form of Orientalism, which has been going on for a very long time. But saddest thing is that some of our intellectuals and some of our thinkers, I would say journalists, they fall into this trap. And you know what the trap is? If you write against India and if your article is published, you get paid in dollars. So sometimes, just to be able to earn money in dollars, you don't mind selling the interest of your own country. That's the extent. It's really pathetic, but that's the extent sometimes we can succumb to or fall down to. So I feel very sad about it. But then these are facts which get highlighted whenever there is some kind of a calamity, or whenever there is an unusual situation, or whenever we are facing what I call a new normal. It only exposes human nature in its best form, and as I say, in its worst form as well.
Very wonderful. Thank you so much. We don't have any other questions. Uh, Thank you so much, sir. And thank you for writing this book and for giving this talk. Thank you, everybody, for attending the talk. Um, you're
Well,
welcome.
I only hope that I have not dissuaded people. I've not given them so much about the book that they will not now approach the book. I would like them to read the book and probably discover much more that I have not talked
No,
about.
no. In fact, it
So,
ignites the curiosity. It's a very beautiful take on the social impact and
yes, it's not a
uh,
personal diary. The very little there is only a chapter or a half on how we went through Corona. The rest of it is all very objective assessment of the situation, looking from outside.
if I'm not mistaken, like just before Corona hit, we had another talk by you on
Yeah,
Sangam Talks, and
yeah.
after that, the infection did catch you, didn't it?
As a matter of fact, let me confess now. You remember the talk was on 20th of March?
Yes, it was.
And at that point of time, we had already given our blood for testing. And after the talk, the moment I walked into the room, my wife told me that the reports have come. And both of us had tested positive. It happened on that very day. So there is a connection with the talk. 20th of March, I still remember 2021, it was. Yes. So we tested positive. I remained asymptomatic. She was symptomatic, but we were holed up in the same room. So there is a chapter there, My Room, My World. There was a stage when actually room became the entire world because you couldn't step out of it.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Aparna and other organizers of Sangam Talks. I'm really grateful to all of you for giving me this opportunity to share my views on Corona Chronicles. God bless you all, especially the listeners, all those who joined this. I am indebted to them. I'm grateful to them. And let them go back to the book and heal themselves